if I don't want to be someone who consistently objectifies women or feels like I have no power over myself but to objectify women, then what I can't do is, through porn and other means, to train myself to objectify women.
This is the first episode that I will actually be able to say, welcome to the Unculted podcast. Because all the ones I recorded previously, the name was still up in the air. We were still trying to figure out what this journey was going to be.
Yeah.
So you get to be the first actual official Unculted episode.
That's awesome. I'm happy to be here.
So everybody watching, this is Jarrett Martin. He's one of my closest friends. We met many moons ago when Jai was a baby.
Yeah, we met in 2014, maybe. So yeah, it's been about 10 years.
It's almost been a decade of friendship.
Which is crazy.
It's so insane. Back when you were a skinny little boy.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So, okay. But I wanted you on here because number one, you're one of my favorite human beings. There are about 1 million episodes that you and I could record talking about faith and life and everything else. And I'm sure there will probably be more to come. But what I find super unique about you specifically, because you have, and we can go into your background and all that, but just your perspective on purity culture, I think is phenomenal. So that's what we're going to dive into. But first, give us a 1 minute highlight of your faith, your, kind of how you grew up, where you are today, hit the highlights.
Yeah. So I am come from a multi-generational line of pastors and ministers. My dad was a pastor. His dad was a pastor. His dad was a pastor. I have 4 or 5 uncles that are all full-time ministry, senior pastors. My sister married a pastor's son. My other one works at my dad's church. So grew up in the faith.
For you to just go rogue and be one of those crazy demon pastor's kids.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Definitely potential that was there. Luckily, I do think that me and my siblings kind of avoided all of the typical either super entitled pastor's kids or super wild pastor's kids, stereotypes. So my family, my dad planted a church when I was 2 years old. So that was all that I saw, all that I knew. Church 2 to 3 times a week, twice on Sundays at least, and Wednesday nights. Started in my parents' living room, and I was on their journey as they grew the church to the few hundred people that they have now. And along that journey, honestly, I mean, just as a kid, you don't really know a ton. You're like, yeah, I gave my life to Christ. You don't really know what that means. It wasn't really super consequential to me. I think in part because life in and of itself was not really challenging. It's a very untested faith of yeah, Jesus is cool. Occasionally you meet kids who are like, oh, I have a personal relationship with Jesus and I talk to him and it's awesome and that's my best friend. I was not like that. I was just purely a cultural Christian at the time. And it wasn't until I was about 16 when I got really serious about my faith. I would say I rededicated my life at a youth conference and then was a pretty big jerk for a while there. Ended up in my own somewhat spiritually abusive ministry for a couple years in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ended up in Dallas. Went to Gateway, Christ for the Nations for a little bit. And then from that point on, after I graduated, I mostly spent my time working in tech, in strategy and growth roles, but then spending all my free time doing pastoral ministry, helping out with a bunch of college kids in Central Texas, and now I live in New York.
So what do you feel like, you talk about kind of rededicating your life at 16, what prompted that? How did you go from growing up in church and it's just a cultural thing to now this is something that I really value and want to commit to on my own?
Yeah, I think that there was an aspect of just intensity that wasn't there. So the conference that I went to was just like the most intense guys in the faith to an unhealthy like way, bordering on fire and brimstone. So going from my parents' church, who they were great, they definitely taught right from wrong and all those things. And then someone saying like, kind of getting in your face and like, what are you actually doing? Do you actually spend time with God? Are you sinning? What's actually going on in your heart? And it was very confrontational, which I think I needed at the time to kind of wake me up out of my 15 or 16 year kind of cultural Christianity. So I would say that was really what the impetus was. It wasn't as much as I think we were all very good kids. I don't think it was as much as like, well, I was actually doing this kind of stuff or that kind of stuff. I was a jerk for sure. I was like an arrogant little jerk, but it wasn't like me and my sisters were like probably not even cursing at that age. I mean, at all. So I think that was something that my faith journey was a little bit different in the sense that it wasn't necessarily like I was saved from our normal depictions of a sinful lifestyle, and it was more so like, oh, I feel like I am actually just being called into deeper relationship with God and to take my faith more seriously than I have before. Yeah.
Okay, you talk about like being super arrogant and being a jerk. I almost feel like for people that are like really heavy into ministry and they really love the Lord and they like go hard, I mean, in a way that technically all Christians should, but you know, the people that kind of dive into ministry, I feel like I have not met one yet that didn't have that season where they're like super arrogant and think that they know everything. I mean, have you found that to be true?
Yeah. I think that's a little bit because a lot of Christianity is somewhat self sorting. So oftentimes people that are in leadership that are highly visible at Christian universities, things like that, are people who are more A type personalities and more leaders. We tend to ignore people who, particularly in the evangelical world, who don't exhibit those qualities. There's something about church that is like, can be entrepreneurial. Um, so, especially if you're like in the mega church standpoint, you might not have a lot of creativity, but it attracts a lot of people who maybe otherwise would be business leaders, things like that. And then lastly, because of those two qualities of like people who want to lead and people who have A type personalities, I think church, especially the circles that we've been in, leadership wise, are more likely to attract people on the narcissistic spectrum because those are two qualities that are like if you already sort the population out to A type personalities who enjoy leading, then out of that there will be more narcissists in that group of people than the general population.
I love
Um,
that you're low key touching on the fact that both of us have like a hidden narcissistic side that we have to keep in check.
sure. Well, yeah, and I think that's an element of it all, right? Is that narcissism is very rarely like nature. Like there are some people who they are very skewed that way, maybe from very, very, very early childhood trauma. But oftentimes it's not nature; it's more nurture. And because of the way that we've set up our systems of faith, it can allow for narcissism to grow and to be developed, particularly in young leaders who are ambitious, who they tend to, because they want to get to a certain endpoint, to be more controlling around people and people's lives. And then all of those things can create a dynamic that really easily nurtures a type of narcissism in us.
Mm-hmm.
So you can go from I'm just a little bit of a jerk and arrogant to being set up in a system that really helps breed narcissism.
Yeah. I don't know if you watched the Hillsong documentary that came out, but I thought what I found very interesting about that, and obviously documentaries are like trying to, you know, adhere to a certain viewpoint. But what I found interesting about the Carl Lentz aspect of that story was exactly what you said. It's like they took this young, attractive, charismatic guy in his 20s, and they gave him a platform and a level of that with like a maturity that he didn't have yet, and then gave him no resources to support that. And it's like, does that excuse bad behavior? No, but also it certainly makes sense of why bad behavior would happen. And I think that's
Yeah.
what we see a lot of times in the churches. Like you said, we set up these programs and these systems where it does feed like bad behavior. It feeds like our sinful nature. It feeds the narcissistic side. It feeds this idea that like pastors and leaders somehow have some sort of access to God that other people don't have, and they have like a higher connection to the Lord and deeper calling. And it's like, I don't know that that's true. Like, I think that's your role in the church. But the Bible talks about this. Like, what are you going to do if you don't have a hand, if you don't have an eye? Like, all of these pieces of the body matter, but we treat leadership type roles as if they matter more, and they don't.
Right. 100%.
Yeah. Anyways,
100%.
that was a little. These are the things that we can rabbit trail on for like this will turn into like a 5-part series.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's many different topics.
Yeah. So growing up, how do you feel like? What do you feel like kept you from becoming like that cliche pastor's kid? Of like going off and doing all the wrong things? Like, was it how your parents parented? Because me as a mom, I want to know, like, I didn't grow up in a home like that. And I certainly did not walk like the straight and narrow path. So what do you feel like was the thing that kept you from doing stupid things?
Yeah. So the more I reflect on it, there is an aspect of there's discipline in the home that I had. So it's like at a young age, you're like, okay, I got to make sure that I don't get my tail whooped. But I think more importantly, the more that I reflect on my parents and their lives, there is a real sense of innocence around, like, in our home. So my parents were exactly the people that they were on stage. They had I've never heard my parents cuss. Like, they didn't listen to secular music. They didn't drink. And it was never like, ooh, those things are like, someone's horrible if they do those things. It was just like, this is what we do. And this is the life that we've built. And as far as their display of their own sexuality, like, my parents would kiss and stuff. My mom would talk about it a little bit. My dad almost never. But there is this real sense of like, oh, we should also, like, you should save yourself for marriage. And this is why we think this is a good decision and a good choice to make. And why we think that this is an unwise choice. So because of like just growing up, and I went to public schools my entire life, so it wasn't like I was unexposed to the outside world. But there was a real innocence in our home where when like my friends were starting to like sleep around when they're 18, I'm like, hey guys, like, are you sure you want to do that? Like, and most people are like, yeah, that's just what everyone's doing at that age. But because it was like, that was like a big deal for me. And cursing was a really big deal, or all of those things were pretty big deals. So, in as healthy as a way as possible, they gave, I think, us, me and my sisters, a really real reverence for all of the vices of whatever that is, and understanding that those things are powerful in and of their own right. So, and that protecting our hearts is the most important thing.
So when you talk about like innocence in the home, because you said it's not like you were unaware of stuff that was going on in the world. You weren't unaware that cursing exists, that drinking exists, of like masturbation, porn, all those things. But so when you talk about innocence in your home, is it more just like that your family was setting an example of like what it looks like to be set apart? We talk about being set apart, of like, we are different and that's just who we are.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely it. Was like, we're different. This is our way of operating. we think this is God's way of operating. And I've like since figured out what my path is there. But I think that was something that we really inherited from our parents, was just like, this is the way. I think in addition to that, something that was really underestimated that my dad did was, I love the fact that he was never overbearing around faith with us, which being a pastor's son, and a pastor, he very easily could have. He never pushed us onto a platform. He never really like tried to evangelize us. He just brought us to church, and we just did church together as a family. And that was the extent. You had to go to church because you're my kid. But the one thing that he did do was every morning we would sit down and read a Psalms, a Proverbs, and something from the New Testament. He'd pray for us. He'd always cook our breakfast, and we'd go off to school. So like consistently listening to something like the Proverbs, which is just all straight wisdom, and you listen to like Proverbs 7, which talks about the promiscuous women, and like, be very wary of the promiscuous woman. She's going to lead you to death. Or later in Proverbs when yeah, or later in Proverbs when they talk about like you should drink from your own well. Why would you indulge in someone else's breast or something like that? And just like hearing those messages from a really young age and listening to them, maybe not even from a perspective of faith and this equals fidelity to Jesus, but from a perspective of wisdom, of like, oh, I should be very judicious about how I handle my relationship with women or sexuality, or the things that is said about how we speak or things like that. So I think all of that definitely impacted me as well.
Yeah, and so to give context in like the most blunt way without like sharing all your business. Like you
Sure.
are someone who has grown up and you haven't engaged in the things that we think are common, even in the church. Because you hear about like, porn is just something that every guy is going to struggle with. Like masturbation
Yeah.
is just something everyone's going to struggle with. But those are things that like, that is something that you just did not do. Like that's just even
Yeah.
and I mean, I guess as a young kid, sure, we didn't have the same technology that kids today are dealing with. But as an adult, because you're nearly 30. How old are you at this point?
32.
Okay, yeah. So at this point,
Yeah.
as a grown man, there is definitely like opportunity. Like you're young, you're successful, you're attractive, you're living in New York City. Like there is ample opportunity to have like taken a hard right, even if you grew up okay and gone, you know what, I'm an adult, I'm going to experience adult things. So what do you feel like was the framework that you had or the foundation that you had that's carried you through even into like your 30s now, where you're like, no, I have this conviction and this is just where I'm standing?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like so much that goes into that answer. I think obviously there's all of the childhood and training that my parents did, which I don't think that they were necessarily trying to get to that end. But let's say like once I was 20, I think I really started to develop my own frameworks around basically all things sexuality. And I think a big piece at the crux of it is maybe the best word for it is like this. I'm giving a couple of things. I will triage maybe the two types of sexual experiences to like porn and masturbation, and then to relationship. I think on the porn and masturbation side, there's like almost this sense of consent and feeling like there's a few different core ideas. Feeling like you are taking something that is not yours. So it always felt oddly when people are like, okay, I either do it to porn, and I was like, okay, you're just watching two other people have sex. If I'm going to have sex, I'm just going to have real sex. Like, I'm not going to be a loser. Or you're like, I'm imagining someone that I know, or someone even that I don't know that may be famous. That always felt just like very, very creepy, because taking something from someone without their consent.
Mm.
You are like indulging in their body in a way that they have not signed off on.
Yeah.
And I think that is very destructive to who we are. So then I think that points to the idea of formation as well. And it became a thing where I was very concerned about who I was forming myself to be and to become. And I started to realize, okay, if I don't want to be someone who consistently objectifies women or feels like I have no power over myself but to objectify women, then what I can't do is, through porn and other means, to train myself to objectify women. That's essentially what we're doing. That fleshes out in 1,000 different ways for men, from the power dynamics that they bring into their own relationships and sexual relationships once they are married, fulfillment. There's all types of like bad and icky things that it can bring into the lifestyle of a man. But for me, the biggest one was protecting my heart and my potential relationship to women, because I want to be someone who is number one, safe. Like, women can feel safe with me. Like, I can sit in a room with Jarrett. He does not want to rip my clothes off.
Mm.
And to be able to be a good brother to women, and to potentially be a good father to not only my kids, but also father in the faith whenever I'm 40 or 50. I cannot do that well if my heart is, if deeply into my heart I am objectifying the women around me.
Yeah.
I can never truly like have a relationship with them in purity. So that was a really, really important idea, was who am I forming myself to be, and who am I to the women around in my life.
Yeah.
And I think Tim Ross has a really great piece on this, where he's often in counseling, he will just tell a woman that he's counseling, I don't want to have sex with you, and they just start weeping and crying because they've never been in the presence of someone who did not want to sexualize them. And creating
that's like the narrative in the church. I mean, that's a lot of what we see, is there's this mass like separation of men and women, where you can't be alone together, you can't have conversations together, it's got to be a side hug, because the assumption there is that if you get male and female together, that all that breeds there is sex. And I'm like, and I understand protecting your marriage and being wise, like I absolutely think that there's space for that. But to your point, like, that is making the sexual experience the highest priority in order, as if all we're doing is walking around wanting to like bang the whole world. And it's like, I don't walk around thinking that. I'm like, maybe men do, but I feel like, is that even if that's true, is that the right way? Like, do we feel like that's how Jesus walked the earth? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, Jesus was giving side hugs. Yeah, I think exactly to your point, the image that God gives us throughout the New Testament, and the New Testament writers gives us for church, is family. And of course, like, you should meet someone at church that you might like and marry them. That's great. But in general, if that's the predominant paradigm, it's like, it would be weird for me to want to have any sort of sexual relationship with my sister or with my mom or with someone like those. Like, family is the most platonic of the sorts of relationships that we have in life. And it's the one that is like the most egregious if it is ever stained with anything sexual between them, to the point that it's illegal, right? It's not illegal to sleep with your coworker. It's not illegal to sleep with your teacher in many cases, especially if you're an adult in university. But to do that with someone in your family is like wrong. Society-wise, we all frown down upon it. And I think I think what Jesus is trying to do there is to invite us into a formation of our sexuality that is so strong, where we can view the opposite sex as simply being family and being part of God's family that we all do together. And to do that, you can't get there if you are sexualizing the people in your family.
Yeah.
Like there's something that's like intensely broken there.
Yeah. So I really like that kind of how you talked about like having consent, because this is, I mean, especially with like young boys today. I mean, and when we look at purity culture in the church, I don't know that it's enough to just be like, well, God says it's a sin. Because number one, I don't even know that it is that black and white in scripture that we can point to it and say that.
Sure.
I think you could probably extract that from scripture, but I don't know that it's that black and white, and I don't know that that's strong enough. So you growing up in like a Christian home, were those conversations that you had where it was like, oh, that was the thing, I knew that it was the sin, and so I was staying away from it? Or was it really just building up that framework of it's weird to treat other humans like this, to be imagining somebody?
Yeah, so there was definitely perspective that it was a sin. I don't know that I would have ever like heard my parents say like don't masturbate or something like that. So I definitely, but there was definitely a framework of like this is sinful behavior, or like people, you know, girlfriends and a girlfriend and guy friend, or a couple, or they're living together, they're not married, you know, they're shacking up. Like that was definitely a take. But to your point, I think you said something interesting. Can you say that part again? What you said again?
Which part?
Before you asked the question.
I was talking about the Bible. Do we think that it's enough that God just says that
Yeah.
it's a sin?
There you go. Yeah, and I think we have to change the way that we've talked about sexuality from this point. I actually don't think us saying explicitly that anything is a sin is generally the best message that we can go with to convince people not to do something.
Yeah.
When I was in my youth, oftentimes it's like, well, you're going to get an STD, you are going to get pregnant, or you are going to be impure and therefore unfit for relationship, or it's the classic like piece of tape where it's like, have you ever seen that analogy?
I did not grow up in purity culture. I grew
So
up in the sex culture.
there's like, yeah, there were a couple of like famous examples that would be used. I don't know if I saw any at my parents' church per se, but I definitely saw them. It would be like, hey, we're going to take this cup of Coke. This cup of Coke's awesome, right? All right, well, we're going to pass it to Christina. Christina spit in the cup. Drew spit in the cup. Jarrett spit in the cup.
I already hate this analogy.
You get to the last person, and it's like, would anyone want to drink this? Well, this is what happens when you have sex with each of your partners. Like, not only do you have this soul tie that is forever there and never broken, but you are going to be undesirable just like this Coke is undesirable.
Oh, wow.
Similarly, there's another one, slightly different concept that is trying to be communicated. It usually has to do with like tape. And I can't remember exactly how it works, but similar, like there's steps, but as the steps go on, the tape gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. And at the end, they're like, you have these two pieces of tape that are very dirty, and you try to put them together, and they can't fit together. Like they're no longer sticky. So basically they say, by having sex, you are going to ruin your ability to attach to your future spouse and partner because you have so many other things that you're attached to. So you are forever going to struggle with your attachment to your partner.
I mean, is there a truth to that? Yes. But the thing that I hate about both of these analogies is that it's putting sex in this camp where it's like dirty and disgusting and filthy. And so then what do you do when then you're on your wedding night and now the mentality is supposed to switch and it's supposed to be this beautiful thing, this like covenant thing that God gave us? It's like, how do you then switch on the brain from that?
Absolutely. Which oftentimes does not happen. Studies show that evangelical women have experienced more pain and vaginismus than any other essentially cohort, like much more than the normal population, because there's so much shame in sexuality. It's two things. One is that there's so much shame in sexuality and making that switch over is very, very difficult. The second thing is maybe more than other cultures. I don't know that we can say this definitively. There is more obligation sex that happens often in between evangelical couples, because now it's like, I've waited, you've been pure, and now your body is mine, and I get to do with it what I want.
Yeah.
So that is often an idea that plays out. So there are toxic ideas for both sides. It's a very patriarchal idea. Most of purity culture is very patriarchal, which I don't, well, that is one of the reasons I don't like using even the language purity when we talk about whether someone has sex or hasn't, because Jesus is who makes us pure. He is the one who purifies us. There's no action in which we are impure or unclean that Jesus hasn't cleansed. So you are not like permanently damaged, permanently unclean. But oftentimes all that messaging was mostly catered towards the girls, and you need to dress a certain way or guys are going to lust. Most guys can't control themselves, so don't go too far. You're going to be impure, and you're going to be therefore less desirable. And what we train all of our girls to is, how can you be a virgin when you get married? For the guys, we care. It's like a fraction of time is spent on how you're a virgin being married. Some of it is like, maybe don't watch porn, and a lot of it is just like, here's how you're courageous. This is how you can be a leader, all those things, as if we don't need our girls to be courageous. And then what happens is when we bring those two things together, and you have a guy who now feels obligated to this other person's body or entitled to someone's body, that's just like a horrible combination.
Yeah.
So it's been, so I think it's been highly destructive to a lot of people.
I love that you reference it as like a patriarchal thing, because realistically, if you just look at how the male body is wired and the female body, women are actually like arguably more wired for a sexual experience. We have more buttons to press. There's like, I think there's studies that have shown that like a female orgasm is like far more intense than a man's. So this narrative that sex is for men, and is like, there's no like scientific evidence or any evidence that that's factually true. But you're right, there is this narrative in the church that like for women, it's something that you need to do for your man. I've watched leaders teach that, where I've watched a leader stand on stage and be like, okay, ladies, at a women's conference, and say, you need to go home and give your man sex, as if it's like not something that should be mutually enjoyable. Like, listen, I think everyone should be throwing down all the time, but it's because I'm having a good time, and both parties should be having a good time. I'm going to be the patron saint of everyone having sex, okay? Everyone needs to have orgasms and enjoy that in the context of marriage.
Yeah. Or I think, to your point, you need to give your husband sex. Sex is something that happens outside of your body, right? It's not something that's not you. It's like, okay, I'm giving this thing that is separate from me away. So I think there's a lot of really destructive messages that are there, and there has to be a better story and a more beautiful story that is told about sexuality to really compel people to think about it differently. And I don't know that I have the answers. I've read a ton of books from people on both sides. I forget the pastor in Denver. I read her book. Her point is basically, look, purity culture didn't work for anyone. Only like the 0.5% of cisgendered straight couples who were virgins when they get married. If it hasn't worked for anyone, then maybe we should just allow people to have sex. And as long as it's consensual and as long as it's within a committed relationship, we shouldn't find a problem with it. So I've read people all the way over to that perspective, to much, much more traditional and conservative voices. I think a few ideas that have resonated with me is that sex is powerful. And anything that's powerful, much like the way that a fire is powerful, you have to be responsible with fire. Fire is extraordinarily great. Like it is one of the single most important things to humans. Yet if we are irresponsible with it, it can also be extraordinarily destructive. And we know that to be true about sexuality. That is the place where the if there was one place where most people have brokenness, it most often shows up in our sexuality. And that is because there's been some mishandling of something that is very, very powerful, whether it's abuse or consensually engaging things or whatever the case is. And we have to acknowledge the fact that it is something that potentially could be destructive. And if something is that powerful, perhaps the best way to guard that is within the confines of covenant. Like maybe that is the way to best protect ourselves. So just like you would take a fire and put it in a pit to ensure that you're not going to get hurt, or if you shoot a gun or a bomb, you're going to go and hide behind something. Maybe covenant is actually the place in which we allow for our sexualities to both flourish, but we're also completely safe in that expression.
Yeah. I like that. I like that thinking a lot more because, kind of going back to what we were saying with like, I don't think sin is a compelling enough argument is number one. I mean, we all know that so much that we do could be deemed sinful.
Sure.
But to me, I'm like, to even say, oh, well, don't have sex because you could get an STD. Okay, but you also might not.
Sure.
Like there's plenty of people who have sex.
Most people don't.
I have had sex and never got an STD. Okay, like you could get pregnant. I had sex before marriage and never got pregnant. So it's like all the things that they're pointing to say this is why you shouldn't because of this negative thing, this negative thing. I mean, and I know we both kind of said this that I don't think it's a sin is a strong enough argument, and the reason why I say that is because then it's not that you actually have a conviction to do right. It's just that you're trying to avoid punishment, which means that you don't necessarily believe the good thing. And so this is the same issue I have with following Jesus in general. If you're following Jesus to avoid hell, I'm like, I don't know that you're doing this for the right reasons. It should be because you're gravitated toward goodness, because you want to act with positive character, because you want to become a good person. So similarly with like the sex and the purity conversation, it's like, is it enough that I'm avoiding this just because I don't want to get an STD, I don't want to get somebody pregnant, I don't want to have a soul tie? And me as a parent, I don't know that I could look my kid in the eye and be like, you're going to absolutely get a soul tie with a person. Yeah. Because there are plenty of sexual experiences that I had that literally did not last past that night. And it wasn't trauma and it didn't linger with me. There were some that did, but there were plenty that didn't. So I like that your approach of going, what kind of person is this making me? And what habits am I forming by even just by becoming an impulsive person? Because a lot of people engage in sexual acts as an impulsive reaction. I'm at a party, I've been drinking, and I have this instant drive and I'm going to fulfill this immediate need. So there's like a sense of delayed gratification that I feel like we've lost, especially in a microwave culture where we can get anything at the snap of a finger. And now we can get any experience. It's the same thing with porn. It's like we've trained ourselves for instant gratification. So if I'm feeling an urge, I can just click a button, go to a URL, and I can get this hit of fulfillment. So, and I even think within parents, there's a lot, if we walk that back, of this craving for like these dopamine hits and everything else, this craving for instant gratification. How could we be training? I love that you mentioned discipline in your house, because it's to me, little things like that are how you're training the brain and training a human being to desire good things at a young age. Because delayed gratification teaches you to wait for the good things. Discipline teaches you, to have a certain order in which you do stuff. So
I think two things I'll delve more deeply into. I think don't sin because it will bring you to hell, I think is a horrible message. I think what can be more useful and more pragmatic is perhaps we don't sin because sin actually deforms us. And that is the chief reason why we don't sin. It's not even because God no longer wants to deal with us. It's that we actually struggle to see God because we deform ourselves so much because of sin, that we struggle to see his perspective, to understand his perspective. So the penalty of whatever sin that happens is actually wrapped up within the sin and is present today. It's not something that's like off for some future eternal reality, but whenever I steal money, I make practice of choosing my needs over others, and I'm no longer self-sacrificial, which means I'm antithetical to the way of Christ in that way. Whenever I am impulsive or objectify someone, I'm forming myself into someone who will use people for my own means and my own ends. That will show up in 1,000 different ways, even outside of the realm of sexuality. And for us to recognize how the things that we do impact the people that we are and that we're becoming, our ability to reflect the mind, the attitude, the heart of Christ to others is, or even the ability to prevent us from having significant traumas or negative experiences. I think all of that is wrapped up into all of the things that quantify and qualify as sin, whether sexual or not. One of the attributes of what makes sin sin is that it inherently breaks relationship. And the interesting thing about what the Bible said, so like, much of what things in the Old Testament are don't steal, don't sleep with their parents, or don't sleep with their parents, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife. So it's all of these things that are breaking and harmful to relationship, either to relationship with God or relationship to the rest of humanity. The interesting thing is that in the New Testament, it says that sexual sin is a sin against yourself. So there is a way in which you break the relationship to yourself as you continue to engage in maybe shameful sexual practices or impulsive sexual practices. So I think all of that builds a much more compelling narrative around maybe some of the negative aspects, but I also think that there are really positive aspects around sexuality and faith of, well, sex is actually intended to happen within relationship. It's not meant to happen in your room by yourself, that God's actually designed you for community and to commune with someone else in this really beautiful way. And there's a lot of really, really compelling reasons and messaging around sexuality there as well.
Yeah, that's good. So what would you say to like young guys in 2024 that are like out in the world, they're dating? What would be like your message to help in that world? Like, let's say we've overcome porn and masturbation. We've climbed that mountain,
Yeah.
and we've stayed on the straight and narrow. Now, as you're like dating, and there's
Yeah.
opportunity, and you are in relationships and you're building connection, how do you avoid like crossing lines, and what are those lines? Because I don't think the Bible has this clearly mapped out. There's no like bases listed out in scripture.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's something that has even been something that I've had to try to figure out and discern as I've dated more, of like, okay, I think kissing's fine, but then, and making out is fine, but then what if this happens, or what if that happens? And it's really like a lot of purity culture is quite binary, because a lot of it does not have to deal with the true motives in the heart. It is, did you put a penis in your mouth or in a vagina? And if so, you are going to be broken and God hates you now.
Yeah.
And they don't talk about any of the other foreplay type things that can happen within a relationship, which is why there's so many why there's so many workarounds and things that Christians do. So I think for me, a few pieces of advice is, one, get very granular with yourself on the man that you want to be. Who do you want to be? What do you want people to know you for? What are the types of relationships that you want to have? What are the relationships that you want to have with women of the opposite sex? I think knowing the values of your partner also makes it a lot easier. So I've dated, for the most part, everyone. Well, I've dated a couple girls that did not have the same values as me. And it's like weird when they're like, hey, I'll send you a nude of whatever you want to see. And you're like, no, no, don't do that. Thank
Please don't
you.
do that.
Yeah. And these were girls that I went to church with. Um, so finding someone that has a real value alignment, I think, is really important. And I think that person it's so much easier to protect someone when you have from crossing lines when you already are on the same page versus someone who's like, I just wish that you were with me right now. Like, I wish we were smashing right now. You're just like, you just feel like you're like holding on for dear life. I'm like, all right, I'm going to make sure that we don't cross this certain line, to really find someone with a value, with values that align to yours. Um, And I think the thing just for me that have always been important in dating is like, I want to be able to have a clear conscience. I want to be able to look your fathers in the eye and not feel, who are God fearing men, and not feel like we have a big secret. And one of the biggest things that I've seen as a leader to a ton of college kids is who were like in serious relationships, relationships that were moving towards marriage, or they felt like it could get there. And one of the biggest reasons, probably from my observation, the biggest reason why I would say for them not to have premarital sex with their girlfriend was mostly because of how I saw shame then wreak havoc on their relationships after. So it was like, we've been living in secret all this time. We feel like we can't be vulnerable with the people around us. We're afraid to tell people everything about our relationship. And you start off your covenant in your relationship feeling like you're hiding something from everyone at church. And anytime you sit down with a leader or a mentor or something, you're like, I lied to them about X, Y, and Z. It's just a really like horrible place to be in. I've seen it just like be the primary reason why very serious relationships have fallen apart. But I think that's very real in the realm of Christian faith, of what do I need to do as a man to protect our relationship from shame, and then also being gracious enough that if we do go further than we expect, how do we bring discipline? How do we bring things back to our relationship and not allow that shame to ultimately destroy us?
Yeah, that's really good. What do you feel like as the church, as like members of the church, as church leaders, how can the church be doing a better job to support people as they're like dating, trying to navigate sexuality? I mean, I know we kind of talked about some of the pitfalls, but what do you think would be like positive shifts that church culture could make to positively impact people growing up in 2024?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Like, I have a girlfriend I'm seriously dating now, and we have tons of mentors who are all very like, we're all super upfront with each other. We have great relationships. It's funny that like so many of them who are in their 50s and 60s, they're like, we were sleeping together before we got married. And some of them were in church, and so like a lot of them were in church. So it's like that, even though my girlfriend and I are not sleeping together, we're not doing oral sex, like there's no sex between us. There, it's been like oddly relieving that there's just people who are just willing to share their experience of like, this is what we did, but of course we don't recommend you guys to do the same thing. And it just has brought the like taboo level around sexuality down so much, and allowed for us to have vulnerability in our relationships with them. It's allowed me and my girlfriend to have really great conversations and not feel like anything's like weird, because we just have the language of talking about sex that's not taboo, it's not shameful, it's not horrific, it's not destroying like I remember talking to one of my like mentors. It's like a couple that we're really close with, and she was like, "Dude, right before I met him, I was like out in the streets, and it was like almost overlapping to the day when we got serious." So she's like, "You can work through it," She's like, "It's all good." So just like hearing that and being like, okay, like whatever partner I'm going to end up with, it's not a death wish if like you have had previous sexual partners or whatever the case is. Like really bringing the temperature down in the way that we've talked about sexuality. Of yes, it's important. Yes, it is powerful and fire. Everyone has a story there. There is no shame for anyone for the stories that we have had or the stories that we'll have moving forward. And having a real celebratory like relationship with around sex is that it's not just for the man, that it is something that is meant to be mutual, that it is meant to be exciting and collaborative and fun, and that it's just as much for women as it is for men. Because I think we start women off on such a bad foot where we inherently believe that there's this power dynamic, like we just invite them into this power dynamic of this is for them. There's a pastor in Dallas that was like, husbands, on the wedding day, you stand where she wants you to stand, do what she wants you to do, and like be what she wants you to be. And then she's like, wives, on the wedding night, stand where he tells you to do what he tells you to do, and just like be. And it's like that and it just makes it, I mean, that's like kind of rapey sounding, but it just makes it feel like all sex is very male centric. So moving that to a more egalitarian view of like, hey, we want to tell a story where sex is for everyone, and that it's mutually enjoyable, but also, again, we want to have a more compelling story around maybe why abstaining is wise. That's not completely shame-based and fear-mongering, but being to tell just that better story of both sin and maybe why sex is awesome and great and should be celebrated.
I love that. I love that you actually describe it as bringing the temperature down, because usually you hear the opposite. When something is important and powerful and has value, usually people are cranking up the temperature and they're like, so it must be this way and it must be under these confines. But I mean, I think you're right, especially like teenagers into early college age. You are like maturity wise and biologically programmed to be in a rebellious state. So the more
Sure.
that we are emphasizing that something is wrong when somebody is already going through a natural maturing phase, it feels like the more you would drive them to exactly what you don't want them to do.
For sure.
I mean,
And just like,
sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, in addition to that, just stop lying to people.
Yeah,
Like, I think that would be a great start of like, okay, I remember going to the church that you and I used to go to, going to one of their young adults nights, and the pastor's like, let me tell you the best sex that you will have in your life. And the whole message was like, you will have the best sex if you wait. That is how you ensure that you have the best sex life. And like, that's just not true. Like, that is objectively not true.
Because there are plenty of people who have waited and have horrible sex lives because they didn't have conversations about it. They have no sexual compatibility. And I'm not saying that means that people who are in that situation need to get divorced. I think you can find sexual compatibility. I think you can learn to press the right buttons. But like, yeah, you're right. That's not a guaranteed pass to have a great sex life.
Yeah, and it's like we just lied to the youth. And I remember one of my friends texted me who went to the same church and was like, he had just gotten married. He was like, honestly, I was a virgin when I got married. We talked about, it's like there's all of this messaging on this is the greatest thing in your life and you have to wait. And he's like, it's great. It's an amazing feeling. You feel more vulnerable than you ever have with anyone else. But like, seriously, like we spent this much time talking about that. Which maybe is a reflection on his situation with anything. But he was like, we spent so much time.
Yeah.
Like it was good.
Yeah.
Like, but
Well, that's the thing. It's like the church acts like all you have to do is wait and then you're guaranteed a great experience. But
Yeah,
realistically, regardless of the background that you come from, sex takes work in marriage because you are two completely different people with different desires, different turn-ons, like different ways of approaching a sexual experience. Even if you both are virgins, you will have a different way that you approach it. So this idea that it's just going to come together with like sparks and rainbows is completely
yeah,
unrealistic. Like it's
for
like
sure.
all things, you have to work for the results that you want. And whether you're
Right.
working through trauma from past sexual experiences or you're working through discovery, either way, there is still work that has to be done.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
That's a
Absolutely. So,
that's
yeah.
a perfect place to end on of like everybody's gonna have to work to have good sex,
Mhm.
not
Yeah.
like monetary
Get in there.
work, but
Get some work done.
everybody's
Do some work, guys.